process. Welcome to Greek Like Me, the podcast about all things Greek. I'm your host, Pamela Diodes Wood. Email us at stealthgreek@gmail.com to share comments, questions, and stories about Greek's Greekness or your own ethnic background. This is part 2 of Asa Jennings and the Greek Genocide of Asia Minor. We'll give a quick recap from part 1, but there's some important historical background on the Asia Minor Greeks and the Ottoman Empire, so we suggest listening to episode 1 first. And trigger warning. We're avoiding the most graphic violence, but it remains horrific. The genocide of the Greek and Armenian people was the first Holocaust of the 20th century. Hitler was literally inspired by the nationalist Turks' extermination of Greeks and Armenians in his more widespread persecution of Jews. Nationalists infiltrating the Ottoman government in the late 19th century began a program of purging Christians from Anatolia. Massacres and the destruction of 2,000-year-old Greek and Armenian settlements surged in the early 20th century, right through the First World War. At the end of that war, the German-aligned Ottomans signed the Treaty of Seva, permitting Allied powers to give control of Smyrna and Greek-majority areas of Anatolia to Greece. But the Allies didn't enforce the treaty. When nationalist Turks led by Mustafa Kemal broke the treaty, attacked the Greek army and villages in Anatolia, the Allies remained neutral, resulting in a mass exodus of Greeks, Armenians, and Assyrians towards Smyrna on the eastern coast of the Aegean. Last time I called wealthy cosmopolitan Smyrna a majority Greek city, but statistic check. In 1922, the Turkish population was 165,000, Greeks 150,000, Armenians and Jews 25,000 each, Western European descendants 10,000. Last episode, we introduced American Asa Jennings, former Methodist minister and recent employee of the YMCA of Smyrna. He was a founder of the Smyrna Relief Committee, which organized food distribution to refugees swarming into the city. Jennings was cut loose by his boss, who dismissed him as a useless, sickly man. He'd had severe health problems going back decades. He was on his own. So when one of the wealthy Smyrniots escaping ahead of the advancing Turkish army donated his mansion to Jennings, Jennings quickly turned it into a safe house and medical station for injured and pregnant women. The Greek army evacuated Smyrna September 8th, leaving hundreds of thousands of Greek and Armenian refugees and residents of the city at the mercy of the Turkish army, who captured Smyrna on September 9th, 1922. Murder, rape, robbery, mutilation followed. Greek religious leader Metropolitan Chrysostomos was turned over to a Turkish mob, tortured, and killed. In part 2, things deteriorate. From the entrance of the Turkish army into Smyrna on September 9th, American, French, and British sailors and officers reported endless violence committed by the Turkish army and residents against Greeks and Armenians. And we go into a little more detail on that in episode 1. People were killed in the streets and in their homes. Turkish soldiers dragged patients out of the Armenian hospital into the street, making room for their own wounded. Mobs attacked anyone on the street. On the evening of September 9th, Asa Jennings was braving the chaotic streets. Frail, hunchbacked, asthmatic, Jennings circumnavigated the city in a borrowed car, picking up as many wounded women and children and any pregnant women he could find to bring them to his new safe house. Most of them had been brutalized. American sailors stationed in the area pitched in against orders to help collect the wounded. The safe house was filling up. People were spilling onto the sidewalk. Jennings asked the sailors to guard the women and children that were huddled outside now. They did and kept gathering more. Meanwhile, Jennings' wife and 3 children waited at home in the relative safety of the American neighborhood. Bandits climbed over the back wall of the house, whether those were Turkish residents turned bandits or it was also believed that bandits followed in the Turkish army and were left undeterred by them. They climbed over the back wall of the Jennings house. 15-year-old Asa Jr. grabbed a gun his father had left behind, killed 2 bandits, and wounded another. They likely would have died otherwise. All night, the family huddled together, listening to shots and screams. There are letters from Mrs. Jennings, and I think a diary where she describes the horrible things that were happening while they were hiding in their own house. The Relief Committee had set up encampments in outdoor public spaces to shelter the large groups of refugees from what became the very dangerous city streets. 2,000 people were placed at the city football field. Churchyards, parks, and other spaces were made into emergency settlements. But the next morning, September 10th, volunteers went out to the campsites and reported that refugees were disappearing. The 2,000 from the football field were gone, their meager belongings left behind, ransacked. It wasn't long before the committee realized refugees were being led out of town and massacred, or marched west toward the interior and certain death. Imagining the hundreds of miles they walked into what they thought was safety, and then to be taken and marched back hundreds of miles without food, without water. More and more bodies littered the city streets as Turkish soldiers picked off Armenians and Greeks, often as they were walking along the road trying to enter the city for safety. The Reverend Charles Dobson, an Anglican minister from New Zealand, reported retrieving the bodies of dead children and nude women who showed obvious signs of violent sexual assault. He joined 2 Greek priests who ministered the last rites of the Orthodox Church and helped him bury the bodies. But there was no keeping up with the carnage. As the killings increased, the number of orphans multiplied, many of whom had witnessed the gruesome deaths of their parents. The Armenians and Greeks fleeing massacres in the countryside continued streaming into Smyrna. Unaware of the violence awaiting, refugees began to gather on the quay. Dozens of desperate Greeks and Armenians, often mothers with young children, tried to swim out to the Allied ships to safety. Allied officers and sailors had orders not to interfere with the Turkish army and not to engage in rescues. Turkish soldiers on the quay shot the refugees in the water. The harbor was filling with bodies. Turkish soldiers and civilians were seen moving from house to house in the Armenian quarter, killing residents, taking their valuables. Women and girls were sexually assaulted first before they were shot. Lieutenant Commander Harrison Nouse of the USS Simpson witnessed this. Like the others, he was following orders not to intervene. That day, September 10th, Mustafa Kemal rode into the city in a Mercedes with a fair amount of pomp provided by the army, cheering by the Turkish citizens. He temporarily settled at a hotel where he'd meet with his commanders and representatives of the Allies when it suited him. According to Giles Milton in his book Paradise Lost, Kemal had already notified the League of Nations by telegram that any violence or upheaval in Smyrna was not his responsibility. Quote, on account of the excited spirit of the Turkish population, the Angora government would not be responsible for massacres. Milton writes, by the afternoon of September 11th, discipline had completely broken down in Kemal's army. Some of the troops, their passions fueled by alcohol, were committing atrocities in full public view. These atrocities, witnessed by sailors with field glasses stationed aboard British and American ships. The accounts of rape and mutilation are absolutely horrifying. Milton says the Turkish army commanders had no control over their men, but this was the famously disciplined Turkish army, right? And the reported level of fear instilled in soldiers by the military governor, Nurettin, alone, never mind Kemal, makes me think the out-of-control behavior was given free rein. Author Lou Oranek, in his History Smyrna 1922, says it was reminiscent of the Ottoman days of old, when low-paid troops were allowed to sack a defeated city. On September 11th, that day, the Times of London reported, all accounts agree that Smyrna has been turned into a charnel house. Several streets were so littered with mutilated bodies, it was impossible to pass for the sickening stench. Jennings focused on creating shelters. He commandeered deserted mansions along the quay, and he and the American sailors hoisted the American flag over each one and continued to bring women and children in. The flags of the Allies were a protective measure, and those, in the beginning, those who wore the flag or hung the flag, it was hands off for the Turkish army. By September 12th, a large group of refugees had taken shelter on the gated grounds of St. Stephanos Armenian Church. Turkish soldiers threw grenades into the churchyard, killing and injuring a number. According to Oranek, the soldiers ordered the gates opened and everyone out. But the bishop of the church refused to comply until finally a Catholic priest guarded by Italian troops escorted the refugees, all women and children, to the quay where they joined the growing crowd of refugees. The Turkish army was sufficiently under control to follow orders to leave Allied soldiers and civilians alone, at least for the time being. That day, American Consul General George Horton reported seeing 9 cartloads of bodies being removed from the area of the military governor's residence, the residence of Nuruddin Pasha. He was a fanatic well known throughout the army for his cruelty and hatred of the infidels, meaning the Christians. Horton reported 3 more cartloads of bodies carried from the railway station. Many bodies were still scattered over the city streets, inside of homes and businesses. The YMCA staff was harboring injured Greeks and Armenians in their building. From the windows, they could see Turkish soldiers going house to house, breaking in, murdering the residents. By September 13th, fires began appearing, spreading through the Armenian quarter. Allied sailors reported seeing Turkish soldiers entering buildings in the quarter, then exiting as fire appeared, locking the doors behind them. Minnie Mills was an American missionary and director of the nearby American Girls' School. She stated she'd seen Turkish soldiers breaking into homes, carrying rags and tins of petrol, then seeing the buildings consumed by fire. This testimony is supported again and again and again by other witnesses, including Turkish witnesses. Refugees were hiding in the girls' school. 8 of them had given birth. Turkish soldiers demanded entrance, but 12 American sailors assigned to stand guard outside persuaded them to leave. Shortly after, a building next door erupted in flames. When the school was evacuated, refugees and many of the students were taken by Turkish troops and not seen again. Soon fires began to appear in the Greek quarter. 12 Greek firefighters had been arrested September 9th when the Turkish army came into the city. There weren't enough firefighters left to battle the many fires, is the hypothesis, but one wonders if they were prevented and sent to protect other parts of the city. The Turkish and Jewish neighborhoods survived the fire despite winds that spread flames. Many Jews suffered death and displacement during the genocide, but they were not the targets. In the end, the Armenian and Greek neighborhoods burned to the ground. It would take more than a week. September 13th, the American consulate gave the order to evacuate its nationals. Jennings and a friend from the International College drove through the American neighborhood, directing everyone to get to the American Theater near the quay by 3 p.m. Greek and Armenian servants and staff were to stay behind. But the Americans snuck 60 Greek and Armenian servants and their families into the theater. Jennings took carloads of Americans to the quay, then drove his family in, dodging corpses littering the streets. He returned to the American neighborhood again and again until Everyone that was supposed to be out was out. Then he checked his safe houses and the Y, where Jennings found an Armenian employee hiding. He snuck him into the American theater with the others. When the commander in charge of the evacuation tried to stop non-Americans from embarking, something that was demanded by the Turkish command, the American women made such a stink, he relented. Jennings said goodbye to his family and stayed behind to protect the safe houses. He installed a Greek lawyer he'd helped earlier as director and translator at one of the safe houses and kept scouring the city for those in need. Several sources mention that at this point Turkish soldiers and civilians were becoming increasingly hostile, as if they hadn't been hostile enough. Even some of the American and European nationals that were left behind were being beaten and robbed. But still the force of their rage and hatred was directed towards the Greeks and Armenians. The brutality is breathtaking. Rear Admiral Mark Bristol of the American Navy, we talked about him last episode. He's the professed Greek hater who admired the Turkish nationalists. He was in charge of the Navy in the region. He reported to Washington, D.C. from his headquarters in Constantinople, quote, "Generally speaking, conduct of Turkish troops of occupation extraordinarily good, discipline perfect. I will never understand this man and how much worse things probably were, thanks to him." Now the real terror begins. It's hard to describe the inferno let loose in the city. The refugees forced out of hiding in the Greek and Armenian neighborhoods as they burned, squeezing in with those already crowding the quay. They were trapped between the fire and the sea. Many were crushed or fell into the sea and drowned. The heat was so intense, Allied sailors reported seeing some of their baggage on the quay erupting into flames. Those wanting to escape in either direction along the quay were prevented by Turkish troops who'd set up machine guns to bar any exit. Milton writes, "The sun rose Thursday morning, September 14th, on a city that was still burning, and a harbor whose surface was pocked with the bobbing bodies of refugees. A British ship spotted the body of a Greek soldier who had been nailed to a wood door in the manner of a crucifixion and set adrift. New fires were being lit, spreading along with the original fires, forcing more and more refugees and city residents to the quay." The following is a dispatch filed by a reporter for the London Daily Mail who witnessed the fire. It was published on September 16, 1922. "What I see as I stand on the deck of the Iron Duke is an unbroken wall of fire 2 miles long, in which 20 distinct volcanoes of raging flames are throwing up jagged, writhing tongues to a height of 100 feet. The sea glows a deep copper red, and worst of all, from the densely packed mob of many thousand refugees huddled on the narrow quay between the advancing fiery death behind and the deep water in front comes continuously frantic screaming of sheer terror, as can be heard miles away." By September 16th, Jennings found himself sheltering the fathers or brothers of the Greek women under his protection. He kept weaving in and out of ravaged city streets, rescuing women and children as he went. Milton says this was a remarkable achievement given that large numbers of out-of-control Turkish regulars were roaming the burned-out city. He continued to rely on American soldiers who seemed genuinely fond of him and were frustrated at orders of non-interference. Hellenic writes the sailors were letting Greek priests into the American consulate, and groups of them had taken Greek and Armenian girls away from Turkish soldiers, telling those soldiers the girls belonged to them, before turning them over to Jennings. Jennings wrote, "I must say the Navy crowd was exceedingly kind in every way." He was so soft-spoken. They happily let him order them about in the service of the victims. Sailors had been ordered not to engage in rescues, but Jennings directed them to save drowning victims as exhausted refugees fell into the water or tried to swim to Allied vessels. And they kept bringing injured women and children to him for safety. He seems to have inspired that in people. U.S. Naval Commander Halsey Powell, stationed in Smyrna Bay aboard the Etzel, noticed Jennings, quote, sheltering people who had been frightened beyond endurance and gently treating their wounds and sicknesses and saying his prayers among them. Powell was sympathetic, but wanted the American flags removed from the safe houses, and the Greek and Armenian men turned out. He demanded Jennings sleep aboard his ship instead of in the safe houses. While on board one night, Jennings heard a cry from the water, ignored by the sailors' orders. Jennings reportedly bawled them out and demanded they drop a rope to save a naked little boy. He had no authority over the sailors at all, but they always seemed happy to be shamed into action. The ship's spotlights showed another figure in the water. It was dangerous to use these lights on the water at night because Turkish soldiers used them to pick off escapees. Jennings again demanded the sailors' help, and the young sister of the rescued boy was pulled aboard. During nights along the quay, Turkish soldiers took advantage of the dark to attack refugees, beating them, killing them, stealing their belongings, or dragging away women they would assault and kill. British and American ships began to track their spotlights over the pier all night to deter the attacks. Multiple sources say Allied ships played music over their loudspeakers to drown out the screams of the victims. As fires continued to rage and drive people to the quay, the Turkish authorities issued an ultimatum to the survivors. All Greek and Armenian men between 18 and 30 were declared prisoners of war and denied exit from Turkey. Most were later massacred. Everyone else had until October 1st to get out or face deportation to the interior. More refugees and city residents crowded around the consulate and safe houses for protection. Captain Powell had been in contact with his superior, Rear Admiral Bristol, the Greek hater, about bringing in an American destroyer to evacuate the children, but Bristol was no humanitarian. Professor James Russell wrote the foreword to Hellanic's book. He refers to the Admiral's opinion that the Greeks and Armenians were mongrel races, and that he thwarted every effort to rescue them. And he did. He lied to the State Department about the seriousness of the situation. He wrote up and threatened officers who tried to get word to the authorities about the dire situation in Smyrna. He rebuffed Powell repeatedly. By the 19th, the Armenian and Greek quarters were completely destroyed. Many died in the fires. The bakeries Jennings had contracted with to feed the refugees, all destroyed. The hospitals had burned down as well, leaving Jennings' safe houses as the only medical care stations. Typhus and cholera broke out. The Turkish army seized most of the available food in the city. Captain Powell was now informed Greek and Armenian men between 18 and 45 would be arrested. On his rounds of the city, Jennings witnessed Turkish soldiers marching hundreds of men, women, and children toward the east. September 20th was Asa Jennings' 45th birthday. He later said he felt God's hand placed on his shoulder that day, and what he called an uncontrollable desire to save the lives of the refugees and threatened inhabitants of the city. 2,000 women and children populated his safe houses, and he was not going to let them die. The relief committee had assigned someone to find ships to take the refugees to safety, and they weren't having much luck. That birthday morning, Jennings caught sight of a passenger ship in the harbor. What the heck a passenger ship was doing in the harbor, I don't know. But he asked Captain Powell for the use of a landing boat and sailor to take him over to it. Powell, anguished over his inability to help the suffering, was about to become Jennings' partner in one of the world's most incredible rescue efforts. He gave Jennings the boat. That ship's captain refused to help, claiming his ship was full. So Jennings directed the sailor to a nearby tramp steamer. A tramp steamer is a ship without a set route or schedule that bops around ports looking for cargo to transport. Asa made a deal with the captain to transport refugees for $5,000. His plan was to collect passage money from those who could pay, the ones who hadn't been robbed yet, and get the rest from the Near East Relief Committee, the largest humanitarian aid organization in the region. Then Jennings approached the Turkish authorities to get permission to let people leave. Smart move, showing deference to those who could wreck any plans for rescue. They didn't seem much interested, but finally agreed to allow women, children, and old men to board the steamer on September 21st. Any man over the age of 17 attempting to leave who was not elderly was dragged away and confined with a growing number of men who would be deported to the interior. Women knew they would never see husbands, brothers, fathers, or sons again. They knew they would die horribly. Those witnessing the separation of families were haunted by the heartbreak, except for the Turkish nationalists, who had so dehumanized the Greeks and Armenians they felt nothing for them. The Jews later suffered the same fate in Nazi Germany. Today it is the Palestinians, Haitians, the Tutsis and Batwa people of Congo, as well as Jews all over the world, who are being dehumanized. When the steamer captain had second thoughts about approaching a harbor where refugees might not be welcome, Jennings offered to accompany the ship the Mytilene, capital of the island of Lesbos. On the trip over, he met the son of a wealthy Italian Smyrna family. Ernesto Aliotti joined Team Jennings. His family had contacts throughout the islands. He spoke Greek and would translate between Jennings and the Mytilene authorities. Together, they got permission to land the refugees and send for a doctor and volunteers to care for them. Jennings met with the mayor, who agreed to accept more refugees if Jennings could provide food for them. Jennings promised the Near East Relief Committee would provide flour. Volunteers offered to take exhausted refugees into their homes. While negotiating with the mayor, Jennings noticed 10 empty ships docked in Mytilene Harbor. He asked the mayor to turn them over to the evacuation effort. The mayor said he'd give Jennings 6 ships if he guaranteed American protection so they wouldn't be attacked or seized. Jennings turned to Powell. On September 22nd, Jennings arrived back in Smyrna, delivered by Lieutenant Commander John Rhodes on the U.S. naval ship Litchfield, thanks to Powell. Powell then ordered Rhodes to take Jennings back to Mytilene to collect the 6 promised Greek merchant ships. Meanwhile, Admiral Bristol, who had no idea what Powell and Rhodes and Jennings were up to, continued to put the brakes on any official American rescue efforts by telling the State Department that newspapers reporting the atrocities in Smyrna were full of hooey. But the truth must have made its way to Washington, because on September 23rd, the State Department replaced Bristol as the de facto head of the relief effort, with someone who was well aware of the extent of Turkish brutality in Asia Minor. Bristol did remain in charge of the American Navy in Constantinople. The Turkish authorities agreed to allow 6 ships into the harbor unless they were flying the Greek flag. Then forget about it. Jennings brought American flags back to Mytilene with him, and he asked Powell for a written order stamped with the U.S. Navy seal that American ships would protect and escort the Greek ships into Smyrna Harbor. A vague letter was mocked up and signed by Rhodes. This document is not in the Navy archives because it was against American policy. It was a stealth order. Jennings presented the order at Mytilene. The mayor decided he wanted to consult with the Greek government in Athens. Imagining how long that might take, Jennings decided to reach out to the Greek government himself. He'd spotted a Greek battleship anchored at Mytilene and asked Rhodes to accompany him on a visit to meet the captain of the Kilkis. Jennings presented these stealth orders to Captain Ioannis Theophanidis and asked for permission to contact Athens via ship's communications. To further complicate things, a number of officers in the Greek military were furious about the Asia Minor defeat and the ineptitude of the Greek royalist government. They were preparing a coup to overthrow the government. Theophanidis was a royalist who knew the temporary prime minister appointed after the war went sideways. Jennings and Theophanides concocted a coded message marked very urgent. Jennings threw Bristol's name around to make it official sounding. The Greek government's first response was that it was too early in the morning for government business, which might explain why the Greek army was such a mess. Jennings and Theophanides sent a message threatening to repeat their request for aid for the evacuation of Greek refugees, uncoded, so every ship of every navy or merchant fleet would understand that the Greek government was abandoning the suffering Greek people trapped in Smyrna. Athens called a cabinet meeting. Jennings told them via ship radio he also wanted Greek merchant ships in the port of Piraeus, near the Greek capital, to join the rescue flotilla. Why not, right? Greece demanded proof of American protection. Jennings answered, American president of committee Mytilene will embark on first ship, meaning Jennings. The back and forth continued. Early September 23rd, as the urgency of the refugee situation weighed on them, Theophanides urged Jennings to send Athens an ultimatum. If the Greek government didn't agree to supply the boats requested for the rescue effort, including the additional ships from Piraeus, the Kilkis would broadcast the American offer of aid and the Greek refusal, and the American Relief Committee would wash their hands of it. While waiting for Greece to respond, Jennings messaged Powell that he would be proceeding to Smyrna with 12 ships and 18,000 person capacity and more ships to be expected. By 6 p.m., the Greek government ordered the mayor of Mytilene to turn the ships over to Jennings and promised ships coming from Piraeus would be at his disposal. When he first landed in Mytilene, Jennings had met a cashiered Greek naval officer who quickly joined the team. A cashiered officer has been dismissed from the Navy in disgrace because of an offense or breach of discipline. Asa didn't mind a rogue. On the 23rd, Jennings appointed that cashiered officer, Panos Argyropoulos, to assume responsibility for, quote, transportation and direction of ships assigned to the American Relief Committee during the emergency connected with the evacuation of Smyrna and elsewhere due to the advance of the Kemal army. Jennings left the next morning with 10 ships, radioing Powell to request an escort on entering the Gulf of Smyrna. 15 ships were soon to follow. Powell had already bribed the Turkish authority to allow the ships to come alongside the railroad pier. When the flotilla approached Smyrna, Asa later said, from quite a way out, I could see the smoking ruins of what had once been the business part of town. It was the most desolate, fearsome sight I ever saw. Women dressed in black crowded the quay, he said, suffering, waiting, hoping, praying for ships. Those ships were only allowed to pull up to the pier 4 at a time, which delayed everything. Turkish soldiers herded 30,000 refugees toward a funnel they'd constructed out of wire fencing. The refugees had to move through a narrow line where they could be scrutinized by soldiers on either side of the fence, robbed of whatever valuables they had left, and prevented from leaving if the soldiers saw fit. Families were separated. If a person had no valuables, they could be pulled out of line and pushed to the street. Temperatures were now close to 100 degrees Fahrenheit, 38 degrees Celsius. The mental and physical torture of the entire experience is mind-boggling. Powell assigned 60 sailors to oversee the process and prevent violence against the victims. Team Jennings only had 7 days left to remove all of the refugees before those remaining were forcibly marched to the interior. On September 25th, no ships entered the harbor due to the poor turnaround time. Jennings accompanied the first 10 ships evacuating and messaged Powell from Mytilene that there were now 100,000 refugees on the island and food was running low. He feared a riot. Powell had gotten hold of the flour needed, but the Turkish authorities wouldn't let it out of Smyrna. If the Greeks wanted food, let it come from Constantinople. The Greek government messaged Jennings requesting that Powell send ships to rescue refugees along the coastline of Anatolia. There were 20,000 north of Smyrna and 25,000 more a few miles south of the city. All were close to starvation, and more refugees were still pouring into the city. Bristol finally caught wind of what Powell, Jennings, and Rhodes were up to. A Greek government minister in Athens had asked an American diplomat to confirm the ongoing protection of the rescue flotilla. The diplomat cabled Bristol, who was furious. 15 Greek ships arrived in Smyrna harbor on September 26th. Jennings had somehow managed to snag more ships to follow, 50 in all, including an ocean liner coming from Piraeus. The Smyrna Relief Committee was able to charter British and Italian merchant ships to join the fleet. Thousands of refugees remained. Time was running out. People were dying on the pier from heat and hunger, injuries and exhaustion. Women were giving birth on the pier. Sailors carried some aboard ships on stretchers. British sailors were a huge help. Powell later said they wouldn't have succeeded if the British Navy hadn't pitched in. A British officer on the scene commented that women who weren't elderly, quote, bore the traces of the worst brutality. They'd been viciously sexually assaulted. The men, quote, would be used as a labor corps in Smyrna for 24 hours, cleaning up the massacre, then marched into the interior to a concentration camp, but none ever reached it. That day, Rhodes, who'd been in Constantinople taking the heat from Bristol, returned to Smyrna with a signed order to rescind the dummy order to protect the Greek ships. Powell cabled Bristol that it had all been a misunderstanding in translation. The Greeks misunderstood. The coup in Greece had started on the 23rd on some of the islands, including Lesvos. He, Powell, had sent a note to the mayor of Mytilene to clarify the situation, but the mayor was a royalist. He'd already been taken prisoner by the revolutionaries. It was chaos out here. By the time Powell had gone back and forth with his commanding officer, another batch of Greek ships were already under escort to Mytilene. The New York Times published an article that Bristol had offered to protect Greek ships evacuating refugees. He couldn't do anything to Powell at this point. The entire United States was watching him. And, quote, the Navy was emerging as the hero of Smyrna. After it was all over, Bristol commended Powell for his work, and that must have rankled. Jennings was now having to coordinate rescue efforts between two Greek governments, the royalist government in Athens and the revolutionary government in Lesvos. Revolutionary leaders promised their cooperation and that Jennings would remain in charge of the fleet. Captain Agiropoulos had been a Republican cashiered by the Royalist Navy, so he was welcome to continue as well. Somewhere in there, King Constantine had abdicated. What a mess. The Relief Committee was regularly providing food for the relocated refugees and the islanders. Mytilene put both a hospital and a food warehouse at Jennings' disposal, while Powell arranged for food shipments from the Near East Relief Committee in Constantinople. The third flotilla of Greek ships left Smyrna on September 27th, carrying 31,000 refugees, helped aboard by American and British sailors. Now that attention was on Bristol's actions, Powell was finally able to requisition a destroyer to meet a Greek freighter Jennings had recruited to pick up the refugees trapped along the coastal towns and cities of Asia Minor. September 28th, Turkish soldiers moved machine guns to the end of the pier, while unarmed British sailors were helping load refugees onto the latest batch of merchant ships. Powell responded by sending one of his ships to the pier. Sailors were ordered to uncover the deck guns and stand at battle stations. It was in direct violation of orders of non-interference, but the Turks backed down. The machine guns were removed, and the British sailors continued the evacuation. Mytilene now had 175,000 refugees, 7 times the normal population. Jennings was already making arrangements with the Greek government to take refugees off of Lesvos and bring them to other Greek islands, as well as the mainland ports of Piraeus and Salonika. There were already a number of refugees on nearby Chios. the island last year's podcast guest, Helen Vardakis' family, escaped to. Friday, September 29th, the day before the Turkish deadline, 11 Greek ships arrived. Refugees had continued to enter the city after traveling hundreds of miles to get there. But suddenly that day, the number of refugees coming to the pier to evacuate dropped. It was believed the Turks had ramped up deportations while the frantic evacuation was in motion. September 30th, Kemal's deadline, the last day for the evacuation. 9 ships arrived in Smyrna Harbor, along with an American freighter. The last 6,000 refugees remaining were evacuated. So the Turkish military government, Nuruddin, extended the evacuation by a week. But it was done. Everyone who could be saved was saved. Women, children, the elderly that had survived. Most of the men were gone forever. 200,000 people had been evacuated in 7 days. Sadly, as Hellenic sums it up, the evacuation of Smyrna was only the beginning of a more massive exodus that would ultimately involve more than 1 million people. Jennings continued to send Greek ships up and down the Aegean coast to rescue survivors. Powell continued to send American naval ships out to escort them. Powell notified Jennings whenever there was a word of refugees, and Jennings sent the Greek ships. Those ships were now met by both American and British escorts, and the British ships also helped relay sightings of refugees to Powell. The second week of October, Jennings went to Athens to meet with the new Greek government and discuss locations for redistributing the refugees packed onto Lesbos and Chios. Greeks and aid workers in the region began calling Jennings Commodore Jennings. It was the first time he was given recognition for all he'd done for the humanitarian aid effort. Coordinating with Powell, the Greek government, the revolutionary government that controlled Lesbos, the Turkish authorities, various relief organizations, hundreds of thousands of refugees were evacuated, saved from the massacre that claimed so many members of their families. Hellenic details a final story of a rescue from Smyrna involving Captain Powell. His ship remained at Smyrna's harbor until the end of October, when it was ordered back to base at Constantinople. A group of orphans was discovered marooned in the city. In a final act of rebellion, Powell allowed his crew to convince him to bring the children aboard before they left. Hellenic writes, the officers and men of the Edsel paid for a house for the children and allotted part of their paychecks twice a month to pay for food and a teacher. Jennings went on to create a new, bigger relief committee to provide medical care and food to the islands that were housing so many victims of the Asia Minor purges. Relief agencies mobilized as many thousands of Greeks and Armenians continued to escape from Anatolia. The American government finally made it official and started fundraising drives to help feed the masses of destitute people. Kemal's nationalist government gave Christians in Asia Minor until November 30th to get out of the interior regions of Anatolia. 250,000 began escaping towards the Black Sea coast. But the Turks would not allow Greek ships to go through the Bosphorus to reach them. Jennings created a base in Athens and arranged for the Greek government to lease ships sailing under the British flag. Admiral Bristol, no doubt gritting his teeth, stationed a destroyer at the port of Piraeus so Jennings could stay in radio contact with Navy ships still helping with the evacuation in Asia Minor. Another massive evacuation began, rescuing Greeks and Armenians from the 700-mile-long coast of the Black Sea. In the north, eastern Thrace had been seized back by Turkey, setting off another mass exodus of hundreds of thousands of Greeks. Jennings remained in the area of Athens even after the refugee flow slowed down in May of 1923. He left for New York later in the year. 350,000 people were saved in 11 days, thanks to Team Jennings and those around them. 1,250,000 saved within a year. The population of Greece grew by 1/5, by more than 1 million people. This only heightened the poverty and famine already plaguing Greece. Asa Jennings was awarded Greece's highest military and civilian awards. Later, he spearheaded the American Friends of Turkey, creating vocational programs, child care clinics, sports clubs, and libraries in Turkey. It closed down during the Depression, but Jennings had proven he saw value in everyone. He'd created contacts in Turkey that he maintained for the remainder of his life, and finally made a fan of Mark Bristol. In 1933, Jennings was in Washington, D.C., attending a conference with Turkish authorities. As he was walking near the White House, he collapsed and died on the way to the hospital, finally succumbing to the damage his heart and lungs had suffered decades earlier. In 2016, the city of Volos, north of Athens, honored Jennings with a memorial attended by the descendants of those he'd rescued. The same year, the Raoul Wallenberg Foundation honored him. In 1936, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt officially approved the nomination of Captain Halsey Powell to the rank of Rear Admiral of the United States Navy. A few days before he was to assume his new post, Powell died of a heart attack. Kemal's government would repeatedly claim Armenians started the fires that destroyed Smyrna. Biray Koloğlu, a sociologist from Boğaziçi University in Turkey, tells us in Forgetting the Smyrna Fire that in the late 1990s, she interviewed elderly children of eyewitnesses. Mehmet Bey, the son of a wealthy landowner in a suburb of Smyrna, quote, told me that the Turkish troops started the fires to clamp down on continuing resistance in Armenian Greek neighborhoods. Quoting him, they, Greeks and Armenians, were armed and still hiding in the houses in these narrow streets, but I think the real reason was to prevent them from coming back. Another elderly child of a witness from a village at the opposite end of the city, quote, also told me that it was the Turkish troops who burned the city and explained it in the following way. We did not want them to come back, and if their shops and houses burnt down, where were they going to return to? Most telling of all in Koloğlu's paper is her reference to, quote, an obscure book written to mark the 50th anniversary of the founding of the Republic was made up of around 60 interviews with Anatolian war veterans. The editors published the transcribed accounts without editing them, and the language of the accounts testifies to the truth of this claim. The soldier she quotes was in Smyrna, now called Izmir, on the day the Turkish National Army took the city. He says, the day we entered Izmir, all that seaside is full of yavur carcasses. Yavur means infidel, and I know I'm pronouncing it incorrectly. Our soldiers have killed them all with bayonets. There were 7 fleets, and all the Greek yavur are throwing themselves into the sea. They're yelling help. Even the fleets couldn't save them. The Armenians and the yavurs didn't give up their houses. The irregulars burnt all those houses. Bombs were exploding. Rifles were fired. Most of the yavurs and Armenians burned alive. Koloğlu says this former soldier clearly states that the fires were started to force the yavur residents of the city from their houses. For him, the burning of the city is not important. The act itself is normalized. What matters is that the enemy was forced out and destroyed. Koloğlu is mostly an apologist, framing the events of Smyrna as a way for the Turkish state to start anew, even as she explores the discrepancies between public record and government propaganda. Not uncommon for people trying to make sense out of the heinous behavior of their forefathers. I see it daily in the United States. Everything you want to know about disgusting behavior toward indigenous Americans is right there in the records, but too many don't want to see it. Turkey, same. I've seen many posts by Turkish people referring to the catastrophe of Smyrna, asking why would Kemal allow a beautiful city to burn instead of just taking it? Burning and purifying land and property owned by the Greeks and Armenians was the MO of the nationalist Turks. It had been stated over and over that the Turkish nation would be rebuilt on purified land. It was a scorched earth policy. Kemal is on record expressing disgust for the architecture and infrastructure of the infidels. H.C. Armstrong, in his 1940 biography of Kemal, says the nationalist leader declared the fire was, quote, a sign that Turkey is purged of the traitors, the Christians, and of the foreigners, and that Turkey is for the Turks. Andrew Mango, in the biography Ataturk, quotes Kemal saying, let it burn, let it crash down. In 1924, the American Tobacco Company, which had owned a huge warehouse in Smyrna, took the Turkish government to court seeking restitution. The litigiousness of my countrymen helped put on record some of the facts that were already being buried in the Turkish archives. Hellenic says, everyone with knowledge of the fires concurred the fire had begun in the Armenian quarter. Firemen from Smyrna, not Greek or Armenian firemen, they'd been arrested September 9, 1922, and marched away. Firemen testified Turkish soldiers and civilians lit fires with rags soaked in kerosene. Witnesses testified that Turkish soldiers forced Armenian families to stay inside their homes as they burned. Turkish army officers at the trial corroborated that during the fire, Turkish soldiers were at the exit points of the quay with machine guns, rifles, and bayonets, preventing refugees and Greek and Armenian residents of the city from escaping. Professor Israel Charny, president of the International Association of Genocide Scholars, says, it is believed in Turkey between 1913 and 1922, under the successive regimes of the Young Turks and of Mustafa Kemal, more than 3.5 million Armenian, Assyrian, and Greek Christians were massacred in a state-organized and state-sponsored campaign of destruction and genocide, aiming at wiping out from the emerging Turkish Republic its native Christian populations. This Christian Holocaust is viewed as the precursor to the Jewish Holocaust in World War II. To this day, the Turkish government ostensibly denies having committed this genocide. Kılıçoğlu writes, silence begins in official accounts and official history. First and most importantly, Mustafa Kemal did not mention the fire in his historically significant first speech to the Assembly on November 4th, 1922. Not a single Turkish novel, film, or memoir deals with it. Turkish official history, propagated through high school textbooks and radio and television programs broadcast on the significant days of Republican Turkish history, preaches that the city was burnt by the Greeks and Armenians in a final attempt to destroy what they were leaving behind. But as we know, the Greeks and Armenians were still there, dying inside their burning homes. Turkish archives document the bodies found there. They were still there, starving, suffering rape, beatings, and death, drowning in the harbor, being used for target practice until the little American Methodist minister brought the boats to take survivors away. Jennings said, I have seen men, women, and children whipped, robbed, shot, stabbed, and drowned in the sea. And while I helped save some, it seems like nothing as compared with the great need. It seemed as though the awful, agonizing, hopeless shrieks for help will forever haunt me. We'll end with quotes from two Asia Minor historians. Lou Orenick says, the slaughter extended to all indigenous Christians in Asia Minor. It was the end of Christianity for all intents and purposes in the place where it had first taken root, Asia Minor. Michael Llewellyn Smith says this, with a horrific appropriateness, the fire expressed in symbolic terms the rooting out and destruction of Greek and Armenian Smyrna. Hellenic Smyrna was dead. Christian Smyrna, too, one of the great ancient foundations of Asia Minor, was dead. The phoenix to rise from these ashes was a Turkish Izmir, purged of 2,000 and more years of history. Our thanks to Greek Genocide Resource Center for providing valuable information on the Greek genocide, and for kindly posting a link to episode 1, and for photos we used on our social media announcements and sources page. Their website offers a timeline of the genocide, descriptions of the purges, citations, photos, and a terrific suggested reading list. Thanks for listening. Greek Like Me is a Stealth Greek production. This episode was researched, written, and narrated by me, your host, Pamela Deodes Wood. Our producer, photographer, and post-production editor is Douglas John. Visit our website at stealthgreek.com for resources, photos, links, and more. Please rate, like, and subscribe. It helps us get noticed so we can keep making content about Greeks and Greek culture. Find Greek Like Me on Facebook and on Instagram at Greek_like_me. See you next time. Yes, us.